Early in the week, election officials in Arizona called the race for Arizona's Senate seat for Kyrsten Sinema, marking only the second time in my lifetime that Arizona has had a Democrat representative to the United States Senate. It also represents the first time in my memory that any election has come from behind after the election night with absentee ballots. With the races in Florida and Arizona that have dominated the news throughout the week, and the race in Wisconsin that possibly should have joined them in the news for the week, but was strangely not talked about after election night, I think it's time that we sit down and we talk about absentee and provisional ballots and what they mean to our country and what they mean to our elections going forward. Absentee ballots are a very good thing in theory. They've helped shape our country and make it possible for people to migrate around the country in search of work and education. They have made it so that people can go overseas or across the country for pleasure, business, or for military service without any sort of worry that their voices will not be represented in their current government, especially where they keep residence. With that being said, this past election has proven time and time again that it is a system that does need to be addressed, and in all rights, it's a flawed system. And for all reasons, it's a system that could mean that we go through another situation like we had in 2000 with Bush and Gore, in ironically the state of Florida over the county of Broward. As far as any of us are aware at this point, as we went to bed on Tuesday night after the election, Martha McSally held a very comfortable lead over Kyrsten Sinema in the Senate race to replace Jeff Flake's vacated Senate seat. When we were waking up on Wednesday, we believed that Martha McSally was going to be the next Senate representative from the state of Arizona, and we had reason to believe that she would. I'm not going to speak to Sinema's character in this video. She has been embroiled in controversies against the people of the state of Arizona and the state of Arizona itself. But Sinema does not represent me. I really can't speak to her character or why anybody would want to elect her. Simply put, I don't live down there. However, what Sinema represents is the idea of flipping the Senate one way or another, or how many votes we're going to need to have in the Senate to confirm judges and Supreme Court justices for the next 2 years. With Ruth Bader Ginsburg being in failing health, that is something that we do need to understand and talk about, and that's a part of the reason that this is such an important election, and why so many people are celebrating right now the fact that officials have called this election for Sinema as it is. When officials called the race for McSally on Tuesday night, representatives from 2 counties reported that there were over 200,000 votes that had yet to be counted in their counties, and the majority of them were mail-in ballots. This is a surprising thought to me, considering the fact that the majority of people I've known throughout my entire life do go and vote in person. And it also surprises me more that the representation of the votes in the in-person votes so drastically differs from the representation of the votes that came in after the fact. We'll talk about that just a bit later. With Arizona being officially called, we do need to take some time and look over to our friends over in Florida, in a race that is still hotly contested and in which people are still counting. Now, this is a bit of a different situation, and there are lawsuits filed in the situation in Florida. From all outside looks at the state of Florida, without knowing anything about the laws in Florida, except for what's reported on mainstream and alternative media, this race should have been over and called long ago. According to multiple news sources, according to Florida state law and Florida state election regulation, all votes must be in and accounted for, possibly not physically counted, but at least accounted for, within a half an hour of the polls closing on election night. However, here we are over a week later, and as of the time I've recorded this video, there's still no definitive answer as to how many votes are still out there and waited to be counted in Broward and Palm Beach counties in Florida. While Florida has not had the case where they have seen their races flipped They have seen a case where Republicans who were running for the offices, who enjoyed a very sizable lead going into the end of Tuesday night, are suddenly sitting at a point where they have dwindled down to leads that are within the margin of error and leads in which they may get triggered for an automatic recount of their districts or of the state. But of course, there's always more to the story, and that's part of the reason that we are still talking about Florida to this day. One of the first things to bring up is the fact that there was a box that was left behind and discovered by a teacher that was marked as provisional. There's some confusion between news sources as to whether or not it was marked as provisional ballots or just as provisional, but the teacher discovered it and reported it. This has been floating around social media now as being shown as nothing but a box that was carrying election supplies. Signs that say vote here, pencils, pens, and other various supplies that were needed to conduct an election. The fact that these things were being stored in a provisional ballots box makes me wonder a little bit about the integrity of the election counting, but nothing makes me wonder more than the story that came out of Fort Lauderdale Airport shortly after the votes were counted, in which there was a bomb scare in the airport and large portions of the airport had to be evacuated because somebody found a box in the back of a rental car that was marked as provisional. One of the things that struck me about that particular story is it's another story where we never got a real mainstream end to this. There's been speculation all over the alternative media, but the mainstream outlets have given way to the fact that it was a bomb scare and then essentially ignored the story after the all clear was called. The Florida story still has a lot of moving parts to it, and there's still more being discovered every day. So we don't know everything there is to know about Florida just yet. But for a second, we can step away from that. I guarantee we'll be talking about Florida again in the coming weeks, but let's step away and take a look at Georgia right now and their gubernatorial race. By all metrics at this point, the Georgia race has been officially confirmed, and Brian Kemp is going to be the new governor of the state of Georgia. By most metrics, we shouldn't be talking about this anymore, but it is something that we do need to stop and take a look at, considering the fact that there are some moving parts in this yet. Now, I've looked into Stacey Abrams' campaign, I've looked into the methodology that she put forward, and I looked at the agenda that she was trying to promote. And I do not specifically agree with Stacey Abrams. However, Abrams does not represent me any more than Sinema does, so I don't want to specifically speak to her character. It's on her constituents as to whether or not she gets elected as the governor of her state. But unlike some of the others, Abrams does have a little bit of a case to be made. I didn't hear an ending to this story, so I'm not 100% positive how it got resolved. But in a viral tweet in which I was discussing, after commenting on somebody else's status, I was ripped up and down by supporters of Abrams who wanted to sit back and remind me of the fact that there were districts in the state of Georgia in which some of the voting machines were unplugged. In the tweet storm, I pointed out to all of the people involved the simple facts that the accountability boards of the state of Georgia should be holding Georgia to. Any place that has electronic voting machines should have paper ballots on hand at the time of an election, and they should have enough paper ballots on hand to cover all of the registered voters plus 10%. This carries over for accidents, and this deals with the fact that sometimes ballots get damaged, sometimes people mismark, and sometimes people come in and register to vote in person at the time. I am a proponent of same-day registration as long as there's voter ID in place as well. I've only seen moderate coverage of this story, so the majority of what I know about it does come from the tweet storm, in which the people that were in support of Abrams are saying that Kemp, as the Secretary of State, was legitimately cheating by unplugging the machines and not having ballots there. Kemp, being the Secretary of State for Georgia at the time, would be responsible for the accountability boards doing their jobs. But the constituency of the area does need to hold the people accountable for the election and does need to hold the Georgia Election Board accountable as well, making sure that all of their votes and voices get counted so long as they are legal to cast their votes. What's fair is fair, and if Abrams believes that she has a case and enough votes in these particular districts to make the case and swing the election one way or another, or put it into a point where it will go to a manual recount, she definitely should pursue it, so long as it's done within the confines of Georgia's election laws. But as of right now, at the time of this recording, the election boards of Georgia don't feel that they have enough votes coming out of these districts before the election machines were fixed to swing the election significantly in one direction or another. This is another story that we should keep watching as the weeks and months go on. Lastly, I want to take a second and talk about the race that isn't getting talked about, because absentee and early voting ballots definitely changed the tide of that election, and it was a very convenient way to do it at the last minute, as we talked about the first time we talked about the midterms. And I am talking about the governorship in my home state of Wisconsin. A couple days after the election was held, Walker officially conceded to Tony Evers. So this race is pretty much in the bag, but it's still something that doesn't sit completely right with me, especially with everything else that's going on around the country. As I mentioned when we talked about it the first time, at the very end of the midterm race, after running neck and neck with Evers, there was a mysterious dump of ballots that came into the state of Wisconsin for Tony Evers, amounting to just enough to bring Evers over the 1% mark in Wisconsin election boards, meaning that there wouldn't be an automatic recount. Now, apparently Walker's lawyers and his accountability board have found that this election is fair and there's no reason to go and pursue it anymore. But it was the timing of it that still bothers me. I do hope that something comes out of this, and with everything else that's going on around the country, it would be easy for me to see something else coming out of this story. I don't think this story is as over as the pundits in my state seem to think that it is. So where does all of this leave us after the elections are done and there's still so many questions out there? I know that financially it's impractical, but with Arizona being in the state that it's in and so many questions still revolving around Arizona, with Florida, where we still don't know how many votes there are to count, with Georgia and a candidate that refuses to concede, and with Wisconsin with that mysterious 30,000 vote dump that changed the whole tide of the election that was neck and neck the entire night, I would not be opposed right now if somebody on the Government Accountability Board or a collection of boards across the country decided that we needed to have this election over again. I understand the fact that an entire country's electoral process should not be changed by the practices of a handful of districts across the country, but with all of the attention that these districts are getting, what do we not know about the districts that we're not hearing about in the news? I don't think it's going to happen. Unfortunately, I don't believe that it's feasible for our country. Elections are very expensive and they do take a lot of planning. This election that we just had has been planned, obviously, since 2016 and probably before, but there was so much planning, gerrymandering, and organization that went into it to make sure that everybody could get to their polling place and vote the way that they needed to vote. However, if the election continues to go the way that it is, I think that it's going to start ramping up tensions along this country. I do think that the cost of having this election over again may be a way to ease some of those tensions, especially if they turn out the same, or we do get a drastically different result and we understand what's going on and what's different. But that's something that election boards would have to weigh. That is something that we would have to look at cost-benefit analysis for across this country and see if it's even feasible. But right now, I think we are just going to have to accept the election that it is as it is and put some more pressure on these districts to make sure that their voting practices are right and everything is counted the way that it should have been. Who knows, we may have to come out and have some manual recounts in some of these areas and figure out just exactly where the numbers fell in order to make the process more fair and more palatable to this entire country. But that's something that we are going to have to look into in the coming weeks as we move up to January 3rd, when everything is set in stone and we can't do anything about it anymore. What do you think about the elections in these particular districts, and how do you think it affects integrity across the country? I always welcome thoughtful and positive discussion in the comment section below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at EdsBlog Twitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks as always for listening to this show and supporting this channel. And remember, never take the words of bloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions. Take care.